Today is March 10th of 2017, and I am interviewing Frank Studnicki in Taylorville, Illinois. And Frank is 51 years old, having been born on June 1st of 1965. And my name is Sue Burkholder, and I will be the interviewer. So would you please, for the recording, state in what war and what branch of service that you served?
I served in the United States Navy, and I served during Desert Shield and also during Operation Enduring Freedom.
Okay, good. Well, let's start with just a little bit of information about you and your family. So if you could tell me when, where you were born, and a little bit about your parents and any siblings that you have.
I was born in Pittsfield, Illinois, and I was put up for adoption, so my parents adopted me. Their name was Ted and Martha Studnicki, and I had one brother who's 18 months older than me. His name's Pat Studnicki, so I grew up in Streator, Illinois. And my parents, they tended to, the family was very military oriented. Mm-hmm. And so it kind of drew me into the military. I had an uncle, Ed, who was in the Navy, and that's kind of what drew me to the Navy. I used to listen to his stories when I was a little boy, and that's kind of what drew me in that direction.
Okay. And what did your parents do? What were their occupations?
My mom was a homemaker, mm-hmm. and my dad was a union electrician.
Okay, very good. And let's see, what were you doing before you entered the service?
Before I entered the service, I was married at the time, and I'd ended up getting divorced, and so I had two daughters, Jennifer Marie Studnicki, and then Nicole April Studnicki, mm-hmm. and I had to have a way to support my children, and so that was my idea, was to go ahead and join the military. Okay. Because I knew that would be a good way for them to get support, and it would give me the opportunity to be able to serve my country, which is one of the things I wanted to do.
Sure. So you signed up and entered into the Navy. Tell us about your first couple days at basic training.
Actually, I went to Coronado, California, and I was in San Diego. My first couple days, I remember when I first got there, it was night, because it took 6 hours just to fly there from Chicago, and it was cold, extremely cold, and I didn't dress for the weather, that was for sure. I had a little bitty shirt on, just a short sleeve shirt and a pair of floppy shoes and shorts, mm-hmm. and so when I was standing in ranks, of course it was extremely cold. Well, then they took us to a barracks and let us have a place to sleep, but sleep actually only lasted about 2 hours. And so they were right over there at 5 o'clock to wake us up, banging on garbage cans to get you out of bed. And then we had to go over to the medical facility to get checked out for medical. Then they took us over to the chow and let us have our breakfast. And breakfast was actually pretty quick. I mean, you went through, they served you, you sat down, you ate, and immediately, once the table was full, they'd just pop everybody up and make them go throw away their stuff. And so it was pretty fast. I mean, it was kind of scary, I guess, at first to me, but it was almost natural. I kind of fell right in to what I needed to do.
What during your basic training, how did that go? First of all, the whole time, and then were there any memorable events during there, or things that stick out to you, or memorable trainers, instructors?
I had Petty Officer Barkley and Petty Officer Green, and Petty Officer Green was it was kind of funny because he was kind of the quiet, didn't say a whole lot. Where Petty Officer Barkley, he tended to be the more loud type who would push us harder. And there were several events that occurred with doing my training. One of the things I'll never forget as long as I live, they give you an M1 carbine rifle, and we had to stand out on the grinder and you had to hold it at a taco grip. And whoever dropped it first, of course, then they would have to, they would take them aside and they'd work them out, make them do extra exercise. And so, I mean, I was just praying not to drop that rifle, because I knew I didn't want to be the guy pulled aside, that was for sure. I do remember too, with Petty Officer Green, when I first learned to march, I wasn't very good at it. I didn't step in keeping stride, and so of course he had yelled at me about it, and showed me what I needed to do. And after he had told me, it was just natural. I mean, I just stepped right into it, and it became pretty easy. But yeah, Penny Officer Barkley is probably the one I remember the most, because he usually was the one that would mash us in the barracks, make you do push-ups, and you have a notebook that you carry, and if you put when you make a 0, you put a line through it. And they check your notebook every day. And this particular day, I had forgot to put the line through my 0, and so I had to do 50 push-ups for it. And I'll never forget that. It was quite an experience.
And how did you feel when you were through basic training and graduating?
I was really proud. My parents had come out, and we got to pass and review, and I was pretty proud of myself. I'd really accomplished something.
Yeah. So what advanced training did you go to?
After that, I went to construction mechanic in Port Hueneme, California. The construction mechanic was an interesting class. The key to it was to be able to learn how to work on diesels, and also gas aspirated engines. And of course I took to that pretty easily, because I did some of that as a kid growing up. My father had taught me stuff about that, and so I took to it pretty well. I had some pretty good friends too when I went there. They came from boot camp with me. Gene Buttrick was a guy that I remember. He was a real good friend of mine. And there was a guy named Patrick Williams that he didn't do so well in class. He couldn't seem to get the concept of doing the mechanics, and so we'd all pitch in together and try to help him through the studying. But unfortunately, he didn't make it. He ended up getting kicked out of the class.
So what was your so you went through your advanced training, and then where did you land?
At the end of advanced training, you were allowed to put in for 3 different duty sections that you would like to go to. And so I put in to go to Adak, Alaska. It's the 3rd island furthest out from on the Aleutian chain. And I put in for that particular duty because it's considered a secluded duty, and it tends to be a feather in your cap when you serve out there. You get recognized for that. And so I wanted to go out there and serve with the public works out there, and that's what I ended up doing.
What was a typical day for you?
Typically, it would start at 7 o'clock in the morning. I would come into to the red shed where I worked, which was part of public works. My job was, my first job I did was to work in the body shop. And I had a petty officer, 2nd class, named Paul Hendricks, that was in charge of me. And he would tell me what he wanted done that day. Usually it would be doing sanding or doing bondoing of different vehicles. Paul tended to do all the stuff as far as painting and things of that nature. That was his position. And so I would usually spend a day basically just sanding. And then usually at 4 o'clock you get off work and you go back up. I lived in Bering Hill, which is a set of barracks that was set up specifically for all the Seabees. And so I would go back up to the barracks, and then usually I would go to chow, and then from chow I would usually come back and I would call home, talk to my family, and then usually go listen to some music. They had a real nice pool table and a TV lounge, and so I'd go sit in the TV lounge or play pool or listen to music or until it was time to go to bed, and usually I'd get my shower and then I'd go to bed.
Did you, back in basic training, did you make any friends that lasted throughout your career?
Yes, two of them actually. There was a gentleman named Charles Prophet that I was real good friends with in boot camp. Then when I went to A school, he was part of my A school. And there was also a gentleman named Mike Prouty. And Mike Prouty actually ended up going to Adak, Alaska with me. And so for the first couple of years, he served there was a gas station there too where they did mechanical work. And he served with that for the Navy Exchange, and I was part of the Red Shed, Public Works. And so I'd see him every day. Whenever I'd go usually to the Exchange for something, I'd always see him. And we'd talk. He'd come over and visit. And it happened to be that Charles Prophet, he went to a battalion, and his battalion actually had come up to ADAC, because there used to be a spot up there where the NMCB battalions would come up. And so I got to visit with him for about 6 months when he was there.
What other things did you do outside of work?
Well, I had a family that I finally ended up, after being in ADAC for, I think I was there probably 3 months by myself, I finally ended up getting my family brought up there. And so I would spend time, of course, with my children. I have my two sons. I have Joshua and Ted, and so I would spend time with them and my wife. We go fishing because there's some great salmon fishing up in Adak. Also, they have ptarmigan. You can go hunt ptarmigan, and so I bought a weapon while I was up there. Bought a .357 Magnum handgun, and you could go out and shoot caribou. And so I had some friends, Rick Lloyd. He used to go out shooting. He had a 44, and I had a friend, John Birch, that was up there. And the three of us, we'd go out hunt caribou, and we'd go hunt ptarmigan. Ptarmigan actually is a lot of fun because they're not very bright a bird. They tend to just sit on the side of the road, and I guess they think you can't see them. So when you go to hunt them, they don't fly. They just sit there. And so you got to kind of shoo them to get them to move, so you can actually have some sport out of it. Yeah, and then also got a second job while I was there. I started working in the for MWR in the auto hobby shop. I used to go down there and I would help people working on their vehicles because I tended to know how to do brazing and welding. I picked that up as a young kid in high school, and so I would help people out with brazing their exhaust on, or if they needed help with their engines. I learned how to do automatic transmissions, rebuild them. So I would help people down there make a little extra money.
Okay. And how long were you there in that position?
I left ADAC in 1990. March of 1990, and then I went to ACB2 in Norfolk, Virginia, at Little Creek, and I started serving there. While I was in ADAC, I had moved up in rank. I went all the way up to a petty officer, 3rd class. I also ended up, while I was there in ADAC, I had my own duty section. I was a duty section leader. In charge of 4 other people besides myself. I also ended up, they put me in a job called Parts Expediter, and so if they would need a particular part for a vehicle, it was my responsibility to find that part and get it sent out to the island so that we could utilize it to fix our different pieces of equipment. Because we had a board that it had all the things that were on deadline. And of course, the idea was to keep stuff off of deadline. And so we ended up, it was about trying to be proficient in getting parts so that we could keep stuff up moving. ADAC tends to get a lot of snow in the wintertime, and they have these rollovers and blowers that they use out on the runway. And during the winter months, you work 12 hours, 12 on, 12 off. And the blowers and the rollovers are the #1 pieces of equipment. So you work hard, diligently, to keep them things up all the time, no matter what. And so I started to work with the direct, what they call a DTO clerk, a direct turnover clerk. And together, we would make sure that pieces of equipment never would go down. We'd buy pieces ahead of time, knowing what might break on it, so that we would keep stuff from going down.
Very good. Cool. Let's see. So, when you finished your time there, what did you go to after that?
Well, like I said, I went to Amphibious Construction Battalion 2, and in the Amphib unit, I was part of the shore duty side of it. There's both the teams. They have 2 teams, blue team and red team. Mm-hmm. And my position there was to work in the automotive part of it, with light equipment first. And then just about, it was shortly about 6 months after I got there, they had to have a person, they call them a parts expediter, and it's classified as a 6101. And what you do is you work for a hotel company in supply. And so being I already came with this knowledge that I had from ADAC, they went ahead and they sent me to school, to California, to go through 6101 school. And then they assigned me to what actually was supposed to be a 2nd class billet. Even though I was a 3rd class, they put me in that particular billet to work with a hotel company to expedite the parts out of the system so that we could keep up our validity of mechanical stuff. And so I did that during Desert Shield, Desert Storm. That was my job. I would work 16 hours a day, pretty much, getting together parts that they would need to fix equipment that was overseas. And so that way, because what had happened was they were getting parts over there that were for aircraft, for our trucks. And I don't know how that occurred, but they said that, that this needs to get fixed. And so they put me in that position to fix that problem. And so I did. I ended up helping to expedite parts over to the Gulf to make sure that they had the equipment they needed, and it was always up. And so what I would do is I would get my stuff together during the day, and then I would pack it in these Gaylords, big boxes, and then I would ship it over at night. I'd have it put on a plane the next day and then flown to the Gulf. That way they always had parts up when they needed them.
So, and how long were you in that position?
I served that position until 1992. When I got ready to get out, I had ended up becoming a 2nd class petty officer in the meantime. I also was put up for what they call petty officer of the quarter. Because during Desert Shield, Desert Storm, we were running at 100% validity. And so I got this write-up to be put up amongst other people for what they call Petty Officer of the Quarter. And it was actually a pretty great honor to have that even. I didn't actually get it, but the gentleman that did get it, I had no problem. Him seeing what he had done, because we had these things called gator freighters that they use to go overseas on, and they load causeways on the side of them. And they were loading these causeways, and this 3rd class petty officer, he's the only one out on the deck, and he's telling the crane operator what to do. And the cable had snapped, and it ended up taking his 2 legs off. And so when that had happened, of course I was like, wow, he deserves a lot more than that, but yeah, he deserves it. And so I would like to say I had no problem with him getting that. It was, I did what I had to do in support of what I was told to do. So, but.
And so that led to you, or shortly after that, did you get out, or how did that happen?
Yeah, I ended up deciding to get out. And I decided I was only out for a brief while, and then I decided to go back into the Navy because I liked being in the Navy. And of course, it was a good job. And when I got out, of course, I had to try to find a job. I got a job for a brief while at Lynn Chevrolet, but they didn't pay much. And so I talked to my wife, and I decided to go ahead and go back in. And once I went back in, I cross-rated over to a aviation mechanic. And so I got to go to Pensacola, Florida, to go to jet blast school and learn how jet aircraft operate, which was a huge difference from an aspirated engine, because of course with jets you can't pull over to the side of the road and change a tire or fix something, and so everything has to be perfect. When that aircraft leaves the ground, you're basically taking the lives of everybody in that aircraft in your hands. And so I went to Pensacola, learned how to work on jet aircraft, and then from Pensacola I got transferred to VAW 113, which is the early warning aircraft with the big dish up on top. And they're turboprops. And so I got to work on the turboprops, and there's a lot of responsibility with that because every day you do a daily on the aircraft. There's a certain standard to the props have to be checked every so many hours. They have to be kept in a certain position because there's a bleed hole on the prop itself, and you'll get what they call a wet prop from the oil running down it. So there's a lot of responsibility within doing that particular job. And I actually enjoyed learning about aircraft because I guess as a kid too, that was something I used to love, model airplanes. And so that was kind of cool to be able to see a different side of the Navy. Being a CB, you're basically a ground pounder. You learn about the M16, 60 cal, the 50 cal, how to lob a grenade, how to use claymore mines, how to use mortar rounds. But when you're in the aviation side of it, you actually get to go to sea and float on a ship. I was on the U.S. Abraham Lincoln, and that was a whole different world. I mean, I think everybody needs to be able to see both sides of it, because once you get to see both sides, you respect what the other guy really is doing out there.
And what was a day like on the ship?
Actually, a day on the ship was actually pretty cool. First of all, and everybody used to tell me about, when you go to sea, you're going to see these things called flying fish. And I thought, no, there's no such thing. Well, yes, there is. There's actually these things called flying fish. And you see them, they skip on the waves basically from one wave to another, but it literally looks like they're flying. And so I'd get up in the morning, we work 12 hours a day. When you go into your work center, which is basically just a small little cubicle on the ship, you get assigned an aircraft for that day. And so your responsibility is to launch and retrieve that aircraft. Whenever that aircraft is launched, your job is to be up there, and they make what they call a safety chain around the front of the aircraft, because once the prop starts to turn, it's mesmerizing, and people will literally walk into the prop. And so your responsibility is, first of all, to hook up the huffer and get the prop going, and then once the prop is running, then you unhook the huffer, and then you join the safety chain. And you keep people from walking in to the prop. Well, then they take and they'll pull the plane out onto the catapult. Once they get it out onto the catapult, your responsibility is to go in, and there's certain holes on the aircraft. Some of it should be, you feel it and it should be sucking on your hand. Others, it's blowing out air. You check the ailerons. You make sure that the flaps go up and down when they run them. You go back to the hell hole, you check the hell hole. There's an airframer that's on the other side doing the exact same thing you're doing. Once they check the hell hole and they close the door on the hell hole, you step back away from the aircraft, and then you give it thumbs up. If you put thumbs up, the shooter is going to shoot that aircraft. And once you do that, he shoots the aircraft, and I mean, it's just amazing to watch that plane go off the end of the the aircraft catapult, because it's going from 0 to 120 miles an hour in like 3 seconds, and it's really cool to see. There's a lot of responsibility too, because then if you don't give thumbs up, if you put thumbs down, they're going to shut the aircraft down immediately, and they're going to pull it off. And so then you're responsible to fix the problem, whatever's wrong with it.
So the aircraft you're responsible for goes out, and it's out for how long?
Usually they will stay out for about 6 hours. The early warning aircraft is responsible. His responsibility is to maintain the entire theater of war. He can see everything there is to see for over 1,000 miles. And so what he does is he is the eyes in the sky for the command that's on board there, on the aircraft carrier. And what they do is they set up the attacks based upon what they see him projecting back to the ship. And so it's interesting to because of course then after that 6 hours they'll come back, and they have these there's 4 catch lines on the end, and they have to try to catch one of the 4 lines. So what you're doing is, your job is to watch to make sure that the hook comes down so that they can catch it, because if they don't catch it, then they got to immediately power back up and take back off. And so once they catch, then you help to bring the aircraft back up by the superstructure, and you're going to do, once again, safety chain. Once they shut down the aircraft, then you do what they call a preliminary on it, and you make sure that it's got chocks on it so that it won't go anywhere. You check the engines to make sure everything's okay with them, that there's no leaks or anything of that nature. There's a hole way in the back of the aircraft where you're allowed to leak so much fuel per minute. It should have no more than three drops per minute. If you're doing more than that, then it tells you that there's something wrong and you need to do some work on it. So then once I would do that, then it would, for me, it would be supper time, and I could go down, and you'd go down to the galley. There's 2 galleys on the aircraft carrier, one in the front and one in the back. I spent most of my time in the front galley. They usually serve like hamburgers, hot dogs, something quick that you can go ahead and eat. So I would go ahead and I would eat there, and then after I would get done eating, I'd go back up and study, because the only way you're going to continue to make rank, of course, is to you got to study your subjects. And so I'd go back up usually to my work center. We would have books up there that you can study from, and so I would sit up there and I would usually study for maybe 2 hours, and then usually I would end up going back to my barracks. Basically, it's what do they call it? I got to think of the name of it. There's about 150 guys in a berthing. You go back to the berthing, and so you can take a shower, which is kind of interesting on a ship, because the way the water runs on a ship is they supply the turbines first. It's all run by nuclear, so that's got to be cooled first. And so you could be starting to take a shower, have water, and be all soaked up, ready to rinse, and you push the button to rinse and there's no water. And so then you got to just dry off and just move on your way. So it's kind of funny when you take a shower, because it's always a challenge. You don't know whether you're going to get to actually complete the mission or what's going to happen. But then usually after you get your shower, you go to your bunk, and I use they're stacked 3 high on a ship. You have a coffin, they call it a coffin, that you lay on, and you have these curtains to give you some privacy. And I would listen usually to music, and usually that would be I'd go to sleep that way, to read a little bit, and then I'd usually go to sleep with my music in my ears, because the catapults run all the time, and all night long you just hear that thing slamming against the thing when they're catapulting aircraft off. And so you turn the music up loud enough and you don't hear it, and so you can sleep. Usually the aviation, all the barracks for the aviation, the berthing areas are all up in front, right underneath the catapults. So, of course, you're hearing that all night long.
And how long did you serve on this particular job?
Well, I was part of VAW 113 for 4 years, and I got to go on cruise during that time one time with the Lincoln, and it was I found it interesting because of course I also got to go from what they call polywog to a shellback. There's a ceremony when you cross the equator. We had gone over to the Persian Gulf, and we had to go directly to the Gulf because of Operation Enduring Freedom had begun. We did 84 days straight of flying sorties. After 84 days, they finally let us pull into the United Arab Emirates, and they have what they call the sandbox there. I got to see what the sandbox was really all about, and I got to spend my Christmas, actually, that was where I spent Christmas of 2000, was in the sandbox. Well, then after that, we went back out to sea, and we, of course, flew more sorties again. And after 4 months of being in the Gulf, they finally let us go to Perth, Australia. So we steamed to Perth, Australia. On the way down, we crossed the equator. And so by doing so, I got to go through the ceremony to go from being a polywog to a shellback, which also is a great honor. I went from there to Hobart, Tasmania, spent some time there, and then we went from Tasmania back to Hawaii, because part of our battle group comes out of Hawaii. And so we dropped off part of our battle group there, and then the carrier went back to San Diego, where the air wing unloads. And then after we got back, the next mission we did, we went to Puerto Rico, and we did what they call a search and identify for cigarette boats that are bringing drugs into the United States. And so we brought 2 aircraft with us for that, and then it's our responsibility to maintain them aircraft. But you get to also work some good hours, because you get to work, you get six days at a row basically that you're off. And so I got to see a lot of Puerto Rico while I was there. And then I came back to the United States, and as I said, 2003, I ended up getting out of that unit, and it was rather a good experience to be able to do that.
Looking at your experience on the sea, do you have any thoughts about how that compares to maybe some former, older wars? Do you feel like things are done? I mean, I know things, get better and better. There's new things that come out, but how do you think they compare?
Well, one of the things that they when you go to sea, they drive into your head, is the situation that happened with the Forrestal. I believe John McCain, as I recall, served on the Forrestal, and what it ended up happening is aircraft landed. When it landed, it of course had to be caught in a net, and so one of the weapons on the side discharged, and it ended up creating a big fire on board. Matter of fact, it literally melted the deck into the berthing areas below. And so then the people that were down below, they couldn't see anything, and a lot of men died in that. Where it seems like, well, I know when I served for Operation Enduring Freedom, they tended to things are much more safe than what they were. You still have a lot of training that you do. You've got to do fire safety training. We learned how to use the catch nets. They're very picky about the ordinances that they have on board. They have cranes to literally push aircraft off the side if they need to, because of for the safety of the men. I think the Navy has come a long way, learning from what happened with the Forrestal, to be able to have a much safer environment for people to be able to work and do their jobs. Now, don't get me wrong, being on an aircraft carrier is one of the most dangerous things you'll ever do, because you literally are walking around on a running airport, walking underneath aircraft that are moving at the time. And so you have to learn about jet blast and how it affects the human body when it hits you. But I think that it's become a much more safe environment, because the command tends to put more place things in place, I would say, to make sure that people are safe. And even the people on board tend to be very vigilant about watching each other. There was a gentleman while I was on board the Lincoln that he was wiping down a A6 intruder, and another A6 intruder pulled out. And when it pulled out, the jet wash off of it literally pinned the guy to the side of the plane. Well, his chief immediately saw it, and they made a chain to grab a hold of this guy and pull him off of the plane so that he wouldn't end up flying over the side. I think that makes a big difference. I mean, you see how people literally pay attention to each other, and they help each other to make sure you don't have these accidents.
Well, how do you feel that your military experiences have affected your life?
I think that my military is probably it's given me a lot of different things. Of course, one thing, of course, is the integrity, to be a good citizen, part of society. I think it also has helped me as far as the training that I've had. I understand the principles about, of course, being in charge of people, and then also of the idea of having someone in charge of me. I think that it also has probably helped me in being more tolerant with the situation of life in general. You learn to be very patient while you're in the service. You also learn to be very, I guess I'd say, responsible, because you have other people's lives in your hands. And I guess that's a big thing for me. Really learned to value life in general and the people around me. That's a big part I learned in it.
Well, if there was one thing you could say to somebody, like future generations who might view or hear this interview, what would you tell them?
I would tell them to join the service, go see the world. A lot of people, they tend to graduate high school, stay within a 50-mile radius of home, and they don't really ever get to see the real world, what's out there. I've got to see, because of the Navy, I've got to be able to see a lot of cultures. I've got to be able to basically travel the entire Pacific realm of the world, and I think that's probably the best thing ever. I thank Uncle Sam, because he basically paid for me to see the whole world. A lot of people never get that. They'll live their whole life and live in one area.
Well, I want to thank you very much for your time, taking time to talk with me today, and thank you for your service to our country.
Thank you.